Okay, we have walked all the way from the beginning of a glucose molecule down to its complete combustion and the release of energy, leaving us only with carbon dioxide and water. Let's now look at the other macronutrients. So, you guys already know that when you break down a carbohydrate, you get 4 kilocalories per gram. And we talked about how our body stores carbohydrates as glycogen, and we have about enough glycogen stored in our body to run 20 miles at high intensity. But fat is this great storage compound because it's incredibly lightweight, which means you get more energy per gram. 9 kilocalories per gram when you break down fat, which is the equivalent of running about 1,000 miles. So let's discuss how we get the energy out of fat. The primary storage molecule of fat in the body is triglyceride, which in order to get the energy out of the chemical bonds of fat, we have to first break apart triglyceride through the process of lipolysis. Lipolysis separates out this glycerol backbone from the long hydrocarbon chains. If you go to the top of the next page of your notes, you will see that this process is facilitated by hormone-sensitive lipase. It's important to start really thinking about how these pathways are regulated. So in your notes, it talks about what activates hormone-sensitive lipase, what turns this enzyme on and facilitates the breakdown of fat. Well, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which get released when the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Glucagon, which is the hormone that's released in between our meals when we have slightly lower amounts of plasma glucose. Growth hormone and cortisol both can release fat, storage molecules of fat, kind of for different reasons. First, just mention again this glycerol component, because I think sometimes it seems like the waste product maybe of the triglyceride, but it really offers some valuable things to the human body. Glycerol is water soluble. Fat is not, right? But the glycerol backbone of a triglyceride is water soluble. So when lipolysis happens, glycerol can just float away off in the blood. And where does it go? Well, it can go to the liver. And because it has those 3 carbons, it can be used as a building block for a new glucose molecule. So the liver can take glycerol and use it in gluconeogenesis. Glycerol can actually jump right into glycolysis. It can actually jump into glycolysis at that step where we form a GAP molecule. So it can kind of jump right into the second half, the energy producing half of glycolysis. This graph just shows that over the time of exercise, we see a greater and greater increase in circulating glycerol in the blood. We'll touch back on this, but this definitely relates back to longer time frames of exercise and a greater reliance on fat breakdown. But the main reason we break down fat is not to free glycerol, but rather to get the energy out of the stored fat. And the process by which we release the stored energy in fat is called beta oxidation. It's called beta oxidation. First, the word beta. So this is an image of one of the most common fatty acids in the body, palmitate. You can see this long hydrocarbon chain. The second carbon in the fatty acid chain is called the beta carbon. So beta oxidation is going to clip this segment down in 2 carbon segments. So since the beta carbon is the second carbon, we call it beta oxidation because we're going to go to the second carbon and clip it there. And then you guys already know oxidation is a loss. So it's going to be a loss of electrons from the fat molecule. The process of beta oxidation is a repeated successive series of steps that ultimately breaks off 2 carbons at a time until you are finally have completely broken down the fat and there is none left and you have gotten what you need out of it. So you have space in your notes to draw out this process of beta oxidation. So we are going to start with a fatty acid. This is a fatty acid that has been freed from the triglyceride molecule through the action of lipolysis. And the first step that we have to do is we have to what's called activate the fatty acid. And we're going to turn the fatty acid into a molecule called acetyl-CoA. This is not the same as acetyl-CoA. So I just want to make sure you don't think I just misspelled that. It is a different structure. So acetyl-CoA is different than acetyl-CoA. Okay, so I'm just going to make that note in case anyone was like, man, she must be tired, just misspelling acetyl-CoA. No, I did not. Different structure. Okay. The process by which we activate a fatty acid does require energy. So this first step, we're going to need ATP. And this is one of those kind of little rare steps where we actually break this guy all the way down to an AMP. Not that it really matters for our purposes in our life, but I just want to make your diagrams accurate. This process of activating the fatty acid also requires coenzyme A to be added. So coenzyme A jumps in, and you end up with acetyl-CoA. So I'm not going to go through kind of the individual steps here, but the process of beta oxidation is a series of 4 reactions that ultimately chop that fatty acid into 2 carbon fragments. So I'm just going to draw that as a big solid line because the individual steps matter less at this point than the overall story. One round through beta oxidation leaves you still with the same molecule you started with, but minus 2 carbons, N-2. So the process of beta oxidation will clip off a 2 carbon segment from the long fatty acid chain that you start with, and you're left with the same fatty acid chain minus 2. So this same guy can come back and go through it again, and again, and again, and again, until we completely break it down and the last 2 carbon segment is left and the fat is gone. In this 4-step reaction, it does require water added. Again, this is probably the less important step, but I like to have your diagrams be complete-ish. We are going to strip some electrons off. This is an oxidation reaction. Oxidation is a loss. We're going to use both of our energy carriers. So we got FAD, grab it on and pulling some electrons off. And we have NAD, grabbing some electrons and pulling them off. Oh. We are also going to release an acetyl-CoA. So coming off of here will also be an acetyl-CoA. These are the things that we've stripped off of the fatty acid chain. Each segment, each 2 carbon segment is going to load up an FAD, load up an NAD, and produce an acetyl-CoA. And then it will go back and do it again and again and again. So at this point, you already know what happens next. We have packaged up some electron carriers. Where are these guys headed? Where do you suppose their next stop is? Absolutely right. These 2 guys are headed off to the electron transport chain. And they will show up at those complexes embedded in the matrix or embedded in the inner membrane and rip the electrons off and hand them off to each other, take an oxygen and reduce a final oxygen and make ATP. Same exact story. Where's acetyl-CoA headed? That's right. You guys are amazing. Citric acid cycle. That's the very first thing that we need. Citric cycle. How about we get a little acid in there? So the process of beta oxidation is pulling off the exact same products that we've already pulled off in other processes that we talked about glucose. But this is, of course, how we break down fat. So we said that one round through beta oxidation, illustrated here as a straight purple arrow, one round cuts off 2 carbons. Can you see where those carbons are? We cut 2 of them off. If you remember that acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon molecule, you're putting this stuff together really well. So this is the carbon leaving right here. And we know that when it goes through the citric acid cycle, it's going to get pulled off as CO2. And then we'll eventually completely remove the carbon. This process is all taking place within the mitochondrial matrix, which is perfect because all of these electron carriers are right where they need to be. The acetyl-CoA is right where it needs to be. We transfer the fatty acid once it's activated into the mitochondria, and then the processes of beta oxidation occur right where it's most efficient, right in the mitochondria. Here is an important point for discussion. I mentioned that glucose is the only macronutrient that can be broken down for ATP without oxygen. It's a very unique thing about glucose that we can get ATP out of it without any oxygen present. But you'll notice we just talked about how we broke down fat, and nowhere in this story did we use oxygen. But I would argue, and so would every textbook in the world that's written about this, that beta oxidation is part of aerobic metabolism. It requires oxygen. So what gives? How can you have it both ways? If there was no oxygen, what would happen to the FADH2 and the NADH? They float on over to the electron transport chain. And if there is no oxygen, what happens? Well, the electron transport chain completely stops. Those high energy electron carriers would have nowhere to go with their electrons, and you would kind of fill up all your trucks. If every FAD is holding electrons, then there won't be FAD available to accept the electron for further breaking down fat. There won't be NAD available, and it would stop beta oxidation. So even though the processes of beta oxidation itself does not use oxygen, without oxygen available, beta oxidation would stop because you would fail to have the oxidizing agents available to accept the electrons from the fat. So the electron transport chain directly uses oxygen. The process of beta oxidation is dependent on a working electron transport chain to recycle the oxidizing agents, FAD and NADs. They are continually available for the oxidation of the fat. Acetyl-CoA is headed to the citric acid cycle, which itself is going to require FAD and NAD available. And if they aren't at the citric acid cycle to accept the electrons as you go through the TCA cycle, that process cannot continue. So you can see this dependency on oxygen even if it isn't directly used. The other thing that you can see from this picture is that the process of beta oxidation does not itself directly make ATP. Beta oxidation is just kind of like a packaging center. It's repackaging the fat in these different forms that we have other processes to get the ATP out. So no ATP is produced directly, although it makes a ton of high energy carriers, and you guys know we're good at getting energy out of those in the electron transport chain if there is oxygen. It does not use oxygen directly, but it must be aerobic. It occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. Let's go back to the picture in the slide. This is kind of a textbook image of the same idea. You start with the triglyceride at top. The breakdown of triglyceride is going to give you glycerol and then 3 of those long fatty acid chains. Glycerol can actually become glucose and go through the process of glycolysis and glucose breakdown. The fatty acids within the mitochondria will enter the beta oxidation processes, whereby you're going to form acetyl-CoA that can jump into the same exact citric acid cycle that you're already familiar with, and the electron carriers can jump into the electron transport chain to ultimately make the ATP. So this is an image of, as I showed before, one of the most predominant fatty acids. And I just wanted to show you in the chemical structure how this works. So we said beta oxidation, you clip 2 carbons off at a time. So this is basically what gets chopped off when you go through the steps of beta oxidation. And each of the hydrogen are carried away on either NAD or FAD and delivered to the electron transport chain. And the 2 carbons become acetyl-CoA, and that will join with oxaloacetate in the TCA cycle. So we said fat is this ideal storage compound because it's light and you can get a ton of energy out of it. For every triglyceride, there are 3 fatty acid chains. Based on the palmitate, which is the most common, each fatty acid chain gives you 147 ATP, and you have 3 of them, so that yields 441. And the glycerol will give you 19, which means that for a triglyceride molecule, you can get 460 ATP out of a triglyceride. A ton of energy to be had. And that's what makes fat so great. So we've talked about glucose. We have talked about fat. What about protein? So as you can see at the top of the next page of notes, protein contributes a pretty small percentage to our total energy requirement. And then there's a list of times when you'll see protein used for energy. There is a degree of amino acids that are freed just with normal protein turnover. If you eat a higher amount of protein, you will use protein as an energy source. And when you are having an insufficient caloric intake, that's a good place your body will go to break down. So when you're in a starvation mode or you're dieting, if you have prolonged exercise and you've depleted all your glycogen stores, you will start using protein, and then we'll talk more about diabetes. So protein as a fuel source means that we have to break the protein down to its core amino acids. And we have to rip the nitrogen off of the amino acid in a process known as deamination. And this ultimately forms urea. Urea can be excreted in the urine, and then that remaining deaminated amino acid has options. It can be converted back into a brand new amino acid and built into some protein somewhere. It can be converted to a carbohydrate or a fat. And you'll notice on the slide that certain amino acids are called glucogenic, which means they make the intermediates for gluconeogenesis. There are other amino acids that are ketogenic, and they make the intermediates of acetyl-CoA and other products that cannot be used to become glucose. But then they can be taken and they can be catabolized for energy, broken down. And you can see this is not important to memorize the different amino acids and where they can be used, but specific to each amino acid, they can jump into the systems you already know, whether it's jumping in as alpha-ketoglutarate or jumping in as fumarate. And then they can just join in the TCA cycle, the electron transport chain, in ways that we already understand. So the principle here is that it's a small percentage of our total energy. When we are using protein, we're stealing it from somewhere else. And the breakdown of protein, once you get down to a deaminated amino acid, is the same processes that we use for our other macronutrients. We are making some of the molecules at different steps in the TCA cycle. So while for both glucose and fat, we can break it down to the ATP generation, this isn't that simple for proteins because they're very different. It's just such a small percentage of our total energy requirement. We're going to kind of largely ignore proteins from now on. So this is a slide that we used either in Unit 1 or Unit 2. Well, actually Unit 2, when we talked about the exercise test. And this really was a slide that led into our big conversation about VO2 and VO2 max. And I just mentioned that during an exercise test, you can measure the percentage of oxygen and CO2 that the person is taking in and the CO2 that they're producing. And this gives you this value called the respiratory exchange ratio. And I mentioned we were going to come back to this. And now that we've talked about these different macronutrients, let's discuss what information are we gaining from the respiratory exchange ratio. When you look at the volume of carbon dioxide produced and you compare it to the volume of oxygen consumed during an activity, it can actually give you information about which fuel source you are using to power that activity. It is based on the concept of respiratory quotient. Respiratory quotient is the actual gas that's going in and out of a cell that's undergoing metabolic work. We can't measure that. We can't get a probe down to an individual cell, but what we breathe in and out of our mouth is very closely associated to our respiratory quotient. So respiratory exchange ratio is the total volume from everything combined, either leaving our body or being brought into our body, but it's meant to really estimate cellular respiration. Let's just walk through these two systems. So the respiratory exchange ratio is the volume of carbon dioxide divided by the volume of oxygen. So RER is the volume of carbon dioxide you produce over the volume of oxygen you take in. So let's first do our carbs, because this is the one we've done a bunch of times already. C6H12O6 combines with 6 molecules of oxygen to produce 6 water molecules and 6 carbon dioxide. And then maybe and energy too. Remember, we got all that energy out. Okay. So if we make this into your respiratory exchange ratio and we put the amount of carbon dioxide on the top, we have 6 CO2, over how much oxygen must have been consumed, it's 6 oxygen molecules. So when you are primarily using carbs as your energy source, your RER will be 1. Because there's equal amounts of oxygen being used to carbon dioxide being produced. This is different from fat. And I'll use palmitic acid as our fat for this, just because, again, that's the most common fatty acid. This is C16H32 oxygen 2. And it requires 23 molecules of oxygen to break down that fat completely. And it produces 16 molecules of water and 16 carbon dioxide. So to calculate the RER, you put the carbon dioxide on top. It's 16 CO2 divided by 23 oxygen molecules. And it gives you 0.7. So when you are primarily using fat as your energy source, you are needing to take in more oxygen than the CO2 you are producing. So your RER is 0.7 or definitely less than 1. This can be helpful when you are doing a graded exercise test to see which macronutrient the individual is predominantly using. It has informed a lot of what we know about exercise and which type of macronutrient is used for which type of activity. So let's look a little bit at the types of macronutrients that we use to fuel activity, and we'll start with rest. So at rest, we are largely at let's assume we're at our resting metabolic rate. I always, I take into account the fact that if you guys are listening to my lecture, it's probably not resting metabolic rate because you're so excited, and I'm sure you got you're breathing heavier and your sympathetic nervous system is activated because this is just oh my gosh, so exciting. But let's just assume everyone's at rest right now. All right, does everybody remember what your resting metabolic rate is? Well, we make it equivalent as 1 MET, right? And that is about 3.5 milliliters per kilogram body weight per minute. Resting metabolic rate. We are primarily fueled by fat at rest. Fat is, again, that ideal metabolic fuel. It has a lot of bang for its buck because of its lightweight and its capacity to hold a lot of energy in that weight. So if the RER of when we're 100% burning fat is 0.7, and at rest we are about 70% of fat, you expect your RER at rest to be around 0.8. So doesn't completely look like fat because there is some component coming from glucose, which would have more of a 1-to-1 relationship between CO2 and oxygen. But there's a much more dominant role for fat at rest. When we transition from rest to activity, that first little boost is primarily fueled by muscle glycogen. Carbs provide energy without the need for oxygen. This can be completely anaerobic. And if you kept moving, carbs really is the dominant energy source for those first few minutes when oxygen use oxygen delivery does not yet meet oxygen demand. So the transition to activity is primarily glycogen. And then from there, when we start talking about activity, which macronutrient you are using is going to depend on the intensity of the exercise and the length of time. So let's first talk about exercise duration. So the very initial activity, those first few minutes, is going to be muscle glycogen. So we just need that little hit of ATP before we truly get the vasodilation and the nice big flow of oxygen to allow our aerobic pathways to take over. The next 20 minutes or so of exercise is going to be a mix of carbohydrates and fat. Typically, it's going to be very dependent on the intensity of the exercise you choose in these early time points. Once you get past the 20-minute mark, so here's 20 minutes, where the exact proportion of fat versus carbs is going to be really, really dependent on intensity, and we'll talk about that next. But once you get past 20 minutes, you will see a change happen, and we start to increasingly rely on fat as our dominant source. Part of this is that we are beginning to deplete our glycogen stores. When glycogen is no longer available right in the cell where you need it, in order to use glucose as an energy source, you become dependent on the blood delivering that glucose. So as the blood becomes a major supplier of the glucose required for glucose metabolism, there will be less and less contribution to glucose and a greater percentage of fat catabolism for energy. Part of the little part that can help to explain this is when you are relying on plasma glucose as an energy source, you are going to see just a very slight dip in blood glucose as you're using that for energy. And what happens when there's just even the slightest dip of blood glucose? It is going to stimulate glucagon. Oops, I forgot a name in there. Glucagon. It also is going to inhibit insulin. Well, glucagon is a hormone that stimulates lipolysis. So when we start using blood glucose, we're going to facilitate the stimulation of fat breakdown through hormones that are released in response to that. As exercise duration continues to increase, you will eventually exceed the liver's ability to make new glucose fast enough. When you outpace the liver's production of glucose with the cellular use of glucose as an energy molecule, then you'll start to see greater dips in blood glucose and an even further stimulation of fat. So there's a real interdependency there, but with increasing duration, a greater reliance on fat. So we said those first 20 minutes are the most determined by exercise intensity. Light to moderate exercise intensity, and this x-axis is showing exercise intensity as percent of a max. So if you look down here on the lower end, there's a much higher use of fat in lower intensity exercise. Fat use can be about 3 times above the resting state. As you increase intensity, you start relying more and more on carbohydrates. So as you increase intensity, you don't increase fat mobilization. You start just using carbohydrates more. The reason that carbohydrates are the ideal macronutrient for high intensity exercises is they have the highest rate of energy transfer, about twice as fast as fat. And you do actually get more ATP per oxygen molecule than when you compare it to fat. Also, at higher intensities, you have a greater activation of the sympathetic nervous system. With increased sympathetic nervous system activation, you get more epinephrine and norepinephrine, and this activates glycogen phosphorylase and helps to break down glycogen and use it as an energy source. So at higher and higher exercise intensities, we use glucose more. Go to the next page in your notes. This is looking at lactate production and exercise intensity. We discussed lactate in the first anaerobic part of our discussion. If you remember, lactate production or lactate would typically start to accumulate when there's a drop in the redox potential, when there's increased activation of fast twitch muscle fibers, and when the rate of lactate production exceeds removal. So what we're looking at on this figure is increasing intensity as we head to the right on the x-axis. And on the top, we're measuring VO2, and on the bottom, we're measuring blood lactate. So obviously, VO2 is a linear relationship with exercise intensity because oxygen fuels work. But on the bottom, if you look at that blood lactate, you'll see that there's almost no accumulation when we're about 50% or less of our VO2 max. What this means is aerobic metabolism is able to fuel work rates when the exercise intensity is about 50% of your VO2 or less. You can use oxygen-consuming pathways, and remember, if oxygen is available, that pyruvate will be shuttled into the mitochondria and used by the TCA cycle. It's when there's insufficient amounts of oxygen that we're going to start making lactate. So you see this critical point in the graph where we suddenly start to accumulate lactate in our blood, and that's largely around about 55% of your VO2 max or higher. This break in the graph where we see this change from a complete flat line to almost a linear relationship is known as the lactate threshold. The lactate threshold is the exercise intensity at which blood concentrations of lactate begin to exponentially increase. This would correspond with a greater and greater reliance on carbohydrates for metabolism, specifically the anaerobic breakdown, because lactate is the kind of byproduct when we don't have enough oxygen to fuel our aerobic pathways. This point at which we begin to accumulate lactate is absolutely altered by training. So if we added into this picture a trained athlete, you would see a much longer time, or I shouldn't say longer time, you would see a much greater range of intensities before they begin to exponentially increase lactate or the accumulation of lactate. So you can actually shift when this occurs. So let's see if we can come up with the training adaptations that would have helped shift the lactate threshold. Let's think back to our earlier units and see how many we can come up with. Well, if lactate begins to accumulate whenever the rate of production exceeds the rate of removal, let's think about any adaptations that allow increase of blood flow to skeletal muscle. Can you write them down? Do you know what they are? We see increased capillary density. That will improve oxygen delivery. And we see improved blood flow distribution. We send the blood right where it needs to go. If we are able to use our aerobic pathways longer, we must have better utilization of oxygen. So with training, we get increased muscle oxygen utilization. So how does the muscle get better at using oxygen? Well, that improved blood flow distribution would go in here. We can see a shift from fast to slow twitch muscles. And fast twitch muscle fibers are going to be much more likely to accumulate lactate. We can see an increased mitochondria. If we have more factories to deliver all that NADH and FADH2, we would be able to keep our lines in our factory rolling better. If we can deliver more oxygen to the entire system, if we can increase cardiac output, we can delay this lactate threshold because we'll be able to give more blood to the muscles, more oxygenated blood to the muscles. So cardiac hypertrophy can help here. The reduction in heart rate will allow greater filling time. The increase in blood volume will allow more blood to be available to be dispersed. The increased ventricular compliance will allow you to fill the heart with more blood. All of this works together to end up increasing stroke volume, to fuel that increased cardiac output. So we start to see this overlap in these adaptations and how they will actually change our cellular use of macronutrients and the relationship between when our body starts needing to rely on anaerobic pathways versus can fuel the aerobic metabolism longer, to be able to exercise harder at a greater intensity and be able to deliver enough oxygen to our cells to fuel that activity with aerobic metabolism. Let's put this all together and think about this from the beginning of an activity. And I'm going to use a sprinter for this activity, even though I know most of our stuff that we're doing in therapy is about ADLs and getting up out of bed and walking. It helps to put this in the context of a sprinter and athletes, as a lot of this fits in with the activity of full-blown exercise. So a sprinter is sitting in the blocks at rest, right? They're primed and they're ready to go as soon as the gun goes off, or however they now articulate that they should start. It's probably not a real gun. At that moment, they are primed and ready. Their sympathetic nervous system is already starting to go because they know they're about to exercise. And then there's going to be an absolutely explosive start. And the explosion out of the blocks is really going to be fueled by stored ATP. That initial pop, the moment that you explode, is going to be that tiny little bit of stored ATP you have. And then almost immediately, you're going to start breaking down creatine phosphate and turning the ADP that comes from that ATP being broken down. And you're going to use this to create the ATP necessary for the next several seconds of activity. The phosphagen system is that simple one-step reaction that will immediately start getting fueled when you break down ATP and accumulate a little bit of ADP in the cell. And we're going to start pumping ATP out using the phosphagen system. As they continue to run and they get to a 200-meter dash, we are going to start using glucose. So at this point, we're going to start running glycolysis. Glycolysis is out in the cytosol. Glycolysis takes glucose and it turns it into pyruvate. The process by which you take glucose and turn it into pyruvate will make ATP to fuel the machinery that's currently running. The glycolysis will produce NADH, which can get delivered into the mitochondria. As the sprinter continues to run and we get to a 400-meter dash, we're going to now start having the blood flow and the response to fuel the aerobic metabolism is going to start to play a greater role. And the NAD can get delivered in, the pyruvate can get delivered into the mitochondria. When the pyruvate gets into the mitochondria, it's going to become acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can go through the TCA cycle. The TCA cycle itself will give us a little bit of ATP, not much, but we're running it a lot, so we're getting a little bit out of that. But it's also going to release, I'm trying to think what color we haven't used yet. It's also going to release some NADH and FADH2. I don't know why I'm acting like I'm singing that tune. Okay, these will be delivered to the electron transport chain. We'll just draw that as one big guy here. The electron transport chain can take those electron carriers, and if oxygen is available, it can pump out. Let's just draw a little oxygen here because that's so important. It can pump out a ton of ATP. As we keep running, now we're going to really have the time to start breaking down fat. And what color is left? So fat, or triglyceride maybe would be better, can be split into glycerol and free fatty acid. Free fatty acid can get delivered into the mitochondria and go through beta oxidation, which will also produce NAD and FAD to get delivered to the electron transport chain. Glycerol can actually come over here and jump into glycolysis as GAP and be used by the glycolytic enzymes that are already up and running and rolling. So you can see the timeline of how early activation of our cellular machinery requires really fast ATP. But these early production abilities are very, very short-lived. And we need the ability to have sustained ATP generation over time. But that also takes a little bit to get those other systems up and running, because you have to get the fat broken down and transport it in and run it through beta oxidation, and the glucose has to get all the way through glycolysis first. So we need these early systems, these anaerobic pathways, to bridge that gap from, maybe sitting in the blocks isn't maybe the best example of rest, but from starting from rest to full-blown activity, we need very quick pathways to buy the time to get the full machinery up and running. But then to do sustained longer duration activity, you're going to need macronutrients that can break down into a lot more ATP. And if we can maintain our oxygen delivery, we can keep that big ATP machinery going. If we can do training adaptations that make us better at delivering oxygen, because we have more mitochondria, shorter distance for diffusion, more blood being delivered to the muscle to deliver even more molecules of oxygen to these machineries, we will be able to fuel the aerobic pathways longer, be able to exercise at greater intensities with less fatigue and more sustained ATP production. That's a wrap for this video series. We will pick up the next video. We'll really pick up the original question that led into this rather long discussion on energy metabolism, and that is our patient who has weight loss goals. Have a great day, everybody.